Hi there. I'm going to be commenting on chapter 15 of Lila, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert M. Pirsig. Again, like in the previous chapter, what's happening here is really one thing. Pirsig is demonstrating the independence of the three levels that matter for human beings in the real world: the intellectual, the social, and the biological levels. We muddle through the abject inconsonance between our captain and Lila on the intellectual and social levels in chapter 14. This chapter is where they connect on the biological, and we've already had hints of that earlier. They're both good with their hands, which is the connection of the body with the environment, and at its base is biological. Also, they enjoyed their meal and booze, and they even finished all those French fries, even though Lila thought she made too many. Some archaeological expedition, he thought. Garbage and more garbage. That's what an archaeologist is, really, a highly trained garbage man. You see all the great finds in museums. You don't see what they had to go through to find them. Some of those ancient ruins, Phaedrus remembered, were located under city dumps. Rigel would really be gloating now. What do you think now, he'd say. Does Lila have quality? What's your answer? Now, if the captain wasn't so intellectually detached, he might find what Lila had to say an interesting insight into another person's inner world. As a therapist, I'm fascinated by Lila and the circumstances that led to this marginal existence she has. But he's digging for patterns and coming up short, since he has a really hard time coming down from the intellectual into, the actual world in front of him with a real person. So he's looking for something theoretical, and what he's getting is, regular stuff. So this attitude does set the captain up as someone ensconced in intellect, and this is what Pirsig is trying to do here. While you and I find what Lila says is rather interesting and sad, and perhaps we're getting some insight into the mind of someone who, was inclined towards intellectual and social failure by her upbringing. And as social beings, we're kind of interested in her story. It's unfortunate, it's tragic, but she has some interesting things to say and interesting viewpoints from the perspective of maybe that we wouldn't have, because most of us looking at this are upper middle class, college educated. So to talk to someone like this is actually really interesting. It gives you a perspective on another way of life. But the captain is painfully aware that something is missing in his understanding. He knows how smart he is and how being so detached causes him to be socially inferior, let's just say, which is very hard for him to stomach. Because he's been in his whole life, let's just imagine, with an IQ like that and getting into college early, he's been so much in the realm of the intellect and understanding how valuable that is, which it is, and it is at the top of the evolutionary hierarchy. So really not being very good on one of these levels is very painful for him, and he doesn't have really a way out of it. What was it she had said about sad sack? He didn't understand women because he didn't understand anybody. You could never get close to him. He was very smart in some ways, but in other ways he was very stupid. You know what I mean? Phaedrus knew what she meant. He knew who she meant. This other pattern made himself in everything he believed in, worthless and comic. This other pattern meaning Lila's assessment of, this nutty professor type, or this kind of Big Bang Theory nerd, let's just say. So then he falls into a dream state, and this is very interesting. After an unknown time, some new patterns returned in the form of shimmering water. The shimmering was above him. And here the biological emerges, and this is actually a kind of lovely and poetic section. I think it's important to look at the big issue that differentiates metaphysics of quality from the regular way of seeing things. So there's a big craze to explain human experience through a biological lens, evolutionary biology, neuroscience, for example. Now, it's not as if these things don't, that these things are not relevant to understanding a human being, but they comprise the biological level. They only address the biological level. This level is obviously a critical aspect to who we are, and in this segment, Phaedrus takes a journey to that level. Biology becomes front and center when he's sexually aroused. But let's go back to the way that regular science looks at human beings when it gets very caught up in this biological explanation. Behaviors in general are not biological, and certainly the behaviors and conversation of the whole last chapter are not biological. They are social. And discussion is social too, because language is social. It's a social pattern. There's a modicum of intellectual in their discussion. Mostly he's trying to use his intellect to get at something. And sometimes they'll speak in abstractions. But Lila doesn't do a lot of this. Most of her language is reactive. She is on the social end of the spectrum that is close to the biological. But the biological likes and dislikes still come expressed in the social pattern of language. An interface, you could say, is this pattern of language. And of course, the captain, Phaedrus, is over on the intellectual end of the biological spectrum. So let's go back to neurobiology, for example. Neurochemistry doesn't explain behaviors, doesn't mean that neurochemicals don't support behaviors. They do, but the behaviors have progressed independently. One thing about behavioral biology, and you can read this in Sapolsky's book, Behave, is that it's not all deterministic. It's the underlying support system that biological support system will change with the environment and even change with social situations. Sometimes genes turn on and off depending on what social situation you're in. For example, some people with genetic predispositions towards collectivism come from the East and they settle in the West, and then their biology can switch up a little bit and the collective gene might turn off and the genes more oriented around individualism might turn on. So that's epigenetics. So it's a dance between biology, the environment, and all aspects of ourself. So just like the intellectual pattern of truth, let's say, in a university is supported by the social university, the admin part, and the social university houses all these biological bodies in the inorganic structure of buildings. However, you could not say that that building determines what is studied any more than biology determines the dynamism of human ideas. Evolutionary and neuropsychologists alike tend to reduce everything to biology, especially these days where there's been so much research in these areas and they're very trendy. This is, of course, misguided and deterministic, and we'll explore more of this in chapter 17 coming up, in which he says something like, if you think along these lines of that biology is deterministic, pretty soon you come up with the notion that DNA contains all the intelligence we need to, for example, devise a metaphysics. If you see biology as supportive of intellectual and social, then it's a whole different ballgame. And evolution and neuroscience become valuable tools to work on specific problems, but they are not explanatory theories. And they are often, especially these days, mistaken for explanatory theories. But the biological level does become front and center to support the higher levels sometimes because we don't procreate. Or if adrenaline isn't triggered by a car heading for us, for example, you can say goodbye to all those fancy philosophical ideas. Pirsig, through the sex scene in this chapter, is showing us how the biological level is evoked and how independent it is from the other levels when it does come forth. All that intellectual and social stuff is forgotten when Lila climbs into bed with him and triggers a primitive subconscious biological state. Sometimes between sleep and waking, there's a zone where the mind gets a glimpse of old, active, subconscious worlds. He just passed through that zone, and for a moment had seen something he would forget if he went back to sleep. But he'd forget it if he became any more awake, too. So there's something about this dream and semi-sleep state that makes you vulnerable for the biological. And he's already primed for this in the state in which dreams, as you know, can take us back to that level. It's the id, if you will, because dreams are a way into the unconscious, and in the unconscious, that's where all the influences of biology are. When they aren't, again, front and center when you have to, when you're doing something biological. And as if to emphasize that state, he cleverly puts himself into the primordial soup, literally, and Lila is represented by one of the most basic biological organisms, which is a jellyfish. He could feel the same currents against his own body. They were pleasant, gentle currents, and he felt serene. His lungs had stopped their struggle long ago, and everything was quiet now. He felt like he belonged here. He had always belonged here. So there's a part of him that's very ancient that could live underwater. Our biological ancestors certainly did. So then he feels this jellyfish come up to him, which is, of course, Lila. The creature nudged and stroked and nudged and stroked until he gradually felt himself being released from a dream, as if he were watching it from afar, a kind of spectator to some ancient ritual he was not supposed to see or understand. That, of course, is his intellect is in there too, observing. The entire scene is described in biological terms and quite beautifully. And it's the natural, pure biological state. And this whole sexual experience is very satisfying for both of them. Intellectual and social inhibitions that could and often do make the sexual situation awkward and shameful and cause sexual dysfunction are totally absent in this scenario. You don't have any of that coming in at all. It is pure biology. His thoughts were swamped by this ocean current of feeling and the huge jellyfish-like body hovering over him, pulsing in and out, expanding and contracting on and on. He could feel huge waves of emotion that were not directed by anything. The only social aspect to emerge is that he waits for her to finish before he finishes himself. And that is, I guess, good manners. So it ends with this basic biological connection. After they make love, there's this basic biological connection that Panksepp described biologically as the emotion of care, where people are connected. Evolutionists and neurobiologists would ascribe it to oxytocin, but we know that this connection has overruled, at least temporarily, the conflict that the two have on the other levels. She was still for a long time. Then a tear fell on his cheek. It surprised him. "I do that for someone I like very much," her voice whispered. It seemed to come from some place other than the body that was above him, from someone who perhaps had been an onlooker at all of this. Then Lila lay back beside him, stretched the full length of her body against him, and wrapped her arms around him as if to possess him forever. And it's interesting because what we realize here, in this tender post-sex moment, is that if both of them could allow their social and intellectual patterns to be more open to each other's differences, this primitive care state that they're in now temporarily could potentially fuel a connection on the other levels. And that is a way that biology comes in and supports connection on other levels. But that's not what's going to happen. These two really are too far apart, and they both have their respective social pathologies because one is too damaged and the other is too smart, and they are caught in a major value trap. That explained what happened tonight. The first intelligence out there in the cabin disliked him and still did. It was the second intelligence that had come in and made love. The first Lila had nothing to do with it. These cellular patterns have been lovers for millions of years, and they aren't about to be put off by these recent little intellectual patterns that know almost nothing about what is going on. The cells want immortality. They know their days are numbered. That's why they make such a commotion. Our shared biology becomes apparent when we have a chance to just compare our bodies, and a perfect time to do this is when someone's asleep. And then all they really are is their biological entity. Then there is another lovely and poetic description of their shared biology as he puts his hand up to the sleeping hand of Lila. The pattern that had caused her to come in and do this also made these two hands alike. They were like leaves of trees with no more knowledge than leaves have of why their cells produced them or made them so alike. They're so old. These patterns are so old. They began to distinguish this body on the left from this body on the right more than 1 billion years ago, beyond comprehension. So this is when he notices the diagonal scars on his forearm, presumably here. It could have been a car accident or some other trauma, of course, but something told him it wasn't. It seemed like more evidence of some past internal war with the thing that had brought her here tonight, some enormous battle between the intelligence of her mind and the intelligence of her cells. If that's what it was, the cells had won. And this comes as no surprise to us. We already know the tragedy of Lila's life and that she might have considered this option once. She might have felt that desperate. Oddly, this is something else they have in common. Their respective problems in the social realm shows us how important it is to be able to operate well on the social levels for mental health. Lila, socially marginalized for being too pleasure-seeking and maybe not even being able to be set up for good socialization because of her upbringing, and the pattern socially marginalized for being too detached and removed and weird. In fact, this line sums it up for him. The mind sitting detached, aloof, and discerning. Lila wants social connection, but is too programmed for biological survival to cultivate meaningful connections. And the captain doesn't seem to want it. He doesn't acknowledge he wants it. But he has like this stray moment when he sees the girl on the streetcar and he so wants to connect to her and wants her to accept him and is so stung by the rejection. In all sexual selection, Lila chooses dynamically the individual she wants to project into the future. If he excites her sense of quality, she joins him to perpetuate him into another generation, and he lives on. But if he's unable to convince her of his quality, if he's sick or deformed or unable to satisfy her in some way, she refuses to join him, and his deformity is not carried on. And then he brings in that great computer metaphor again. It fitted into the independence and opposition of levels of evolution that was emphasized in the metaphysics of quality. At this moment, asleep, Lila doesn't exist any more than a program exists when a computer is switched off. The intelligence of her cells had switched Lila off for the night, exactly the way a hardware switch turns off a computer program. And then he talks about what we think is us. And this is a very Eastern concept, by the way. You will certainly find Alan Watts talking about this a lot. This self-appointed little editor of reality is just an impossible fiction that collapses the moment one examines it. This Cartesian me is a software reality, not a hardware reality. And of course, this is the hardest thing for us to comprehend, is that we are not who we think we are, that our intellect is the totality of our being, and it's a big problem in the modern world, and I'll get into that a little bit. But what about that other side of that divinely dynamic experience the two just had? What about this meeting of ancient patterns does the social level find so appalling? Mystified and somewhat horrified, too, at the things bodies do without its permission, all of this sexual morality of Rigel's. It wasn't just social codes, it was also part of the sense of horror at these cells, we. This is the Cartesian me, we, has invaded, and the strange patterns of quality that existed before we arrived. We, the software reality, finds these hardware facts so distressing that it covers them up with euphemisms and clothes and toilets and medical secrecy. From the cell's point of view, sex is pure dynamic quality, the highest good of all. I'm going to make a little segue here. Dynamic quality, the highest good of all. This is the front end of the train. This is at the top of the hierarchy. Dynamic quality is the highest good of all, no matter what level you're on. So this statement clears something up that we've been wondering about for a while. In the metaphysics of quality, God, good, quality, they inhabit the center, the front end, the top of the hierarchy. They are the thing that's always in front, always changing. If you can connect to it, you're doing good. You know, you're going in the right direction. It is what you could call spirituality. So this dynamic area, it's where you go into the flow state. It's where positive change happens. It's where things get updated. It is what patterns are evolving towards, the highest good of all. So when Phaedrus told Rigel that Lila had quality, he was telling the truth. She does. The same attraction, which is now so morally condemned, is what created the condemners. Okay, so let's get back to Lila the judge. Now, we can see a contradiction here. If you remember, he was talking about Lila will select or will not select this man to carry on her genes. And when on the streetcar, she did not select him. However, again, there's a contradiction. If sexual choice is the choice of quality in a mate, then why did Lila sleep with the captain? And this is not explained in a satisfying way in this chapter. Lila is a judge. That's who lay here beside him tonight, a judge of hundreds of millions of years standing. And in the eyes of this judge, he was nobody very important. Almost anyone would do, and most would be better than he. That is not quite describing what he said about the sexual selection, because the ultimate biological judgment is whether she sleeps with him or not. The element that's left out of this whole very valid exposition about female selection is why a woman would be promiscuous, why anyone would do, why would he do just as well as anyone and not as well as someone else? Well, we know why he wouldn't do as well as someone else. If she picked the right guy, maybe there would be a different outcome for her. But she picks any guy. And it's because there's something wrong with her judging instincts. And usually that's something like a skewed desire for social connection, which makes sense from the perspective of Lila's particular tragedy, her inability to connect socially, coupled with the fact that she really loves sex and will have it with anyone, or, is fairly indiscriminate, so it seems. And that's fine on an intellectual level, where we're not using social mores to judge her. That's very modern, to have sex with whoever you want to. But it's exactly the opposite impulse that is needed to carry on the species. It will carry on the species, but not in the right way, let's just say. After a while, he thought, maybe that's why the famous Gioconda smile in the Louvre, like Lila's smile in the streetcar, has troubled viewers for so many years. It's the secret smile of a judge who has been overthrown and suppressed for the good of social progress, but who silently and privately still judges. Well, I think that's right, and it's a good point to make. If something doesn't make sense, if you have something troubles you, like this little smile makes you uneasy, then maybe you're not looking at it from the right level of analysis, so to speak. Sad sack, that was the term she used. It had no intellectual meaning, but it had plenty of meaning nevertheless. It meant that in the eyes of this biological judge, all his intelligence was a kind of deformity. She rejected it. It wasn't what she wanted, just as patterns of intelligence have a sense of disgust about the body functions, the patterns of biology. So do Lila's patterns of biology have a disgust about the patterns of intelligence. They don't like it. It turns them off. Well, it turned her off on the social level, but it didn't turn her off on the biological level. So this still doesn't make sense because she went ahead with it. So I think the social level really needs to be explored more to make sense of this. Now, what this chapter is about is, showing us how this biological level can be so independent. So going into all this social stuff here isn't appropriate in this chapter. I get that, but it still creates this contradiction. Then he thinks of Sidis, William James Sidis, who we talked about earlier, that great genius who everyone made a fun of and who he relates to. And what emerges is that Sidis didn't want to have anything to do with biology or the social level. He only wanted to have something to do with intellect because he thought that this stuff, the social and sexual stuff, would draw him away from where he really needed to be. And everyone here, we're talking about Lila, the captain, Sidis, have a real problem on the social level. One gets used by the social level, the other gets taunted by it, let's just say. They are both marginalized by the social level, but in different ways. There are two different kinds of pathologies here. And except for some disorders of the biological level, such as schizophrenia or real bipolar, not the mood disorder that everyone calls bipolar, most psychological problems are maladaptions on the social level, which is why these two have these problems. It's their inability to manage the social level. Is it better to have wisdom, or is it better to be attractive to the ladies? That was a question debated by Provençal poets way back in the 13th century. Sidis opted for wisdom, but it seemed to Phaedrus there ought to be some way you could have both. Well, of course there's a way to have both. It means you need to cultivate and find important all your levels, and that's something we all should be doing. Interestingly, I've started to integrate this multi-level understanding and respect and cultivation into therapy, and I think it's starting to help. I still have to work on this because this is a fairly new concept for me, at least my understanding, my more sophisticated understanding that is occurring now is new to me. When you understand all the levels, people are much less likely to engage in one of the most self-destructive actions a person can engage in, which is self-loathing. And we're all little regals hating ourselves because our intellect is not able to control the rest of us. In the world of objectivity, it makes total sense that we can control ourselves with our mind. But in the real world, it's impossible. We have to embrace all our levels. We have to embrace all our parts. And we have to understand them and work with them, not against them. The question seemed to imply the stupidity of women, but a feminist could turn it around and ask, is it better to have wisdom or be attractive to men? That's practically the theme song of the whole feminist movement. Although the feminists and the male Provençal poets would appear to be condemning the opposite sex, they are in fact both actually condemning the same thing. Not men, not women, but the static biological antagonism to social and intellectual quality. So again, don't fight yourself so much and your life will be much richer. A woman who embraces all levels can assert herself as a woman and be just as powerful as a man. It doesn't have to be in exactly the same way. And in this day and age, our social world allows for a woman to do anything she wants in any domain, more or less, because the biological level has been, because we have tamed biology to the point that we don't have to delegate work to one sex or the other. We've got it covered. The technology's covered that. Intellectually, however, you can thank the early feminists when they were dynamic, when this pattern of oppression of women needed updating. And you can thank those early feminists for helping to fix this great intellectual pattern of equality. Nowadays, the rigid militant feminists insist that this problem still exists, because to update this pattern and acknowledge how much progress has been made means that this cultural immune system that a lot of feminists have married themselves into will begin to decimate, and that can't happen if you live in a cultural immune system, and that's a problem. Phaedrus, with his dynamic insight into this whole thing, acknowledges finally, at least, that his biological level can be respected. He still has to work on the social, but he does get somewhere with this warm embrace of the biological level and, with this beautiful poetic way that he presented it in this chapter. That was the only good thing that had happened all day, the way their bodies paid no attention to their social and intellectual differences and had gone on as if these people that owned them didn't exist at all. They had been at this business of life for so long. So I hope that made sense, and I'll see you next time.